The rain had always been her favorite lullaby. It danced on rooftops like a quiet symphony, soothing the ache of loneliness that sometimes crept into her heart when the world got too Lara stood under the small awning of the old bookstore. On Mercer Street, her umbrella had betrayed her halfway through the walk, a rogue gust of wind flipping it inside out like a cruel joke. Now, her coat clung to her, damp, cold, and smelling faintly of wet pavement and lavender she didn't mind there. Was something comforting about the melancholy of rainy days, like the sky was crying with her. For her, she glanced at the door of the bookstore, whispers in wonder. It was closed, of course, Tuesday, always closed on Tuesdays. She forgot every time then, just as she turned to leave. She saw him across the street under a navy blue umbrella, tall, motionless like he had stepped out of a painting and gotten lost in the wrong century. He was watching her, not in a predatory way. No, it was different. It was like he knew. Lara's heart gave a strange little flutter that didn't happen often, not anymore. The man stepped off the curb without hesitation. His boots splashing through puddles, she instinctively stepped back, spine pressed to the cold glass of the bookstore. Her fingers tightened around the broken umbrella still clutched in her hand. He stopped just in front of her, rain cascading off the edge of his umbrella, creating a perfect little dry circle around them. Didn't seem right, he said softly, seeing someone so beautiful left out in the rain. Alara blinked. His voice was low, velvet smooth, like honey stirred into tea, calming, intriguing, unfamiliar. Do I know you? She asked. Wearily he smiled, but there was something sad about it. Not yet. Alara stared at him, really stared, trying to place his face. Something about him felt familiar, but she couldn't say why. His features were soft yet defined, jawline traced like gentle sculpture, kind eyes, the color of overcast skies before thunder. He wore a simple charcoal coat, dusted with droplets and the faintest scent of cedar and rain. I'm sorry, she said, voice barely louder than the rain. But do you usually approach strangers like this? He chuckled, low, almost a breath. Only when they look like they've lost a little piece of their day. Alara blinked again, unsure of whether to be flattered or creeped out. But there was nothing threatening about him. He wasn't pressing into her space, just standing close enough that she could hear him over the storm. His umbrella angled protectively over both their heads. A moment passed in silence. Just the sound of the rain and the quiet hum of the city around them. Are you always this poetic? She asked. He tilted his head. Only when the rain asks for it. Alara felt her lips twitch into a smile before she could stop them. Come on, he said gently, offering his free hand. Let me walk you somewhere dry. I don't even know. Your name, she replied, eyeing his hand. He nodded. You're right, I'm Kale. Kale. Yes. And if I take your hand, you're not going to drag me into a van or a cult or something? He laughed again, and this time it reached his eyes. No van, no cult, just a warm coffee shop around the corner if you want. Or I'll just stand here and keep you company until you decide I'm harmless. Alara hesitated. Then, in a moment she wouldn't understand for weeks, she slipped her hand into his. His fingers were warm, wrapping gently around hers, and suddenly the cold of the rain disappeared. The cafe he led her to was tucked behind an alley where the vines grew thick on the brick walls and the signs were faded with time. The name was etched into the glass. The Hollow Tree She. Dee walked this area 100 times and never noticed it before inside. It was like stepping into a dream-warm golden light strung across the ceiling, wooden shelves stacked with books, candles, and mismatched teacups. A soft piano played from an unseen corner. The air smelled of cinnamon and old paper. Wow, Alara, whispered Kale, didn't say anything, just smiled and gestured to a small table near the rain-dappled window. He ordered her a cup of lavender chai without asking when it arrived. She wrapped her hands around it, grateful for the warmth. You're not from around here, are you? She asked, watching him over the rim of her cup. He raised an eyebrow. What makes you say that? You walk like someone who doesn't belong to time. He blinked, then laughed softly. Now who's being poetic? She shrugged. I'm serious, you don't seem ordinary. He looked at her, then really looked at her, as though studying the spaces between her words. I think, he said quietly, that maybe you don't either. Alara's cheeks warmed, and she looked away, suddenly aware of how close their knees were under the table. There was something strange about Kale, not in a bad way, not dangerous, just unfamiliar, like he existed just outside the frame of normal life, and yet, with him, everything felt slower, more vivid. The hum of the cafe, the soft clink of mugs, the way the rain traced rivers down the window beside them. She found herself wanting to ask him everything about where he was from, why he was here, why he'd noticed her, but instead, she asked, what do you do? Kale looked thoughtful for a moment. I listen, he said. To what? To people's stories, the space between sentences. I'm a writer, I suppose, but not in the way most people are. Alara tilted her head. That's cryptic, he grinned. Good, you get bored if it was easy. The storm had passed by the time they left the cafe. Streets were slick with moonlight and puddles, reflections dancing like liquid stars beneath their feet. They walked in a kind of silence that didn't need filling, a rare silence. The kind that grows between two people who've stepped out of time. Kale didn't hold her hand this time, simply walked beside her, close enough that their arms brushed every few steps, like the universe was nudging them together again and again. So, Alara said softly, you really just listen for a living? Kale smiled. Not for a living, for life. There's a difference. She gave him a skeptical look. That's either profound or pretentious. Probably both. He stopped suddenly at a corner where the streetlight flickered. Looking up, she followed his gaze to the old rooftop of a bakery. There, he whispered. That's where I go when I need the world to stop. A bakery roof? She asked. It has a view of the stars even in the city. Alara looked at the darkened building. Isn't? Got trespassing? Kale shrugged, mischief in his smile. Only if someone catches us. She hesitated, and then she surprised herself. Okay. They climbed the fire escape like children sneaking into a secret fort. The metal groaned beneath their steps. But the night seemed to hold its breath for them at the top. The world opened up, the city lights blinked in quiet constellations. The air was cool and smelled like rain and roses, and something ancient. Alara sat on the edge of the roof, legs dangling. Over a heartbeat louder than the traffic below, Kale sat beside her, close but not too close, respecting the space between, yet somehow making it feel less empty. Tell me something true, she said after a moment. Kale didn't answer right away then. With eyes on the stars, he said, I used to be afraid of silence. I filled it with noise, people, music, distractions. I thought if I sat still long enough, I'd hear something I didn't want to. What changed? I met someone, he said, glancing at her, and suddenly the quiet wasn't so lonely. Alara's throat tightened. Was she someone important? She is, he said, his voice lower now. Still, Alara tried not to read into the way he looked at her just then, but the flutter in her chest gave her away. She wrapped her arms around her knees and looked up at the stars, trying to ignore how warm his presence felt beside her. Days passed. Then week scale became a soft rhythm in Alara's life, appearing without warning, disappearing just as gently. Sometimes she'd find him waiting at the bookstore steps too, cups of coffee in hand. Other times, she'd receive a paper crane with a quote scribbled inside, slipped through her mail slot or tied to her doorknob. He was never predictable, but he was always present, and Alara couldn't stop thinking about him. She went on with her life, teaching her weekend art classes, helping her neighbor's cat give birth in a shoebox, baking muffins she didn't even eat just to fill the air with something warm, but nothing filled the spaces he left behind one. Evening, as autumn began to bloom into the edges of September, Kale took her to the lake. It was late, past midnight, the kind of night where the world feels quieter, like it's listening to They Sat on the Old Dock, feet skimming the surface. Their reflections waltzing on the ripple scale, leaned back on his hands, looking up. Do you think people meet by accident? Alara shook her head. No. I think sometimes the world whispers when we're about to find someone who changes us. He turned to her then, and for a moment, everything fell away. The lake, the stars, the world, just his eyes, I think. Said, voice barely above a breath. You were the whisper Alara's breath caught. There was no kiss, not yet, just the closeness, the weight of words unsaid. The knowledge that something was shifting between them, tectonic and slow. But undeniable, she didn't speak, she couldn't instead. She reached over and gently touched his hand, and he laced his fingers through hers like they'd always been meant to. Alara had never believed in the idea of fate, but now she was starting to. Kale had become more than a presence in her life. He was part of the rhythm. He wove himself into her days like thread in a tapestry. Never overshadowing, never demanding. Always there, and that scared her more than she could admit, because the last time she let someone in this deep, it had ended with her trying to forget how much she'd lost. It was late again. They were in her apartment. For the first time, soft jazz playing from the old record player. The lights dimmed low enough that the shadows seemed to breathe. Kale had offered to fix her bookshelf. One of the wooden slats had come loose, tilting the entire thing dangerously to one side, but halfway through the fix, they'd ended up on the floor, surrounded by scattered books, half-drunk tea, and laughter that had faded into silence. He sat across from her, one knee bent, the other leg stretched out beside her rug. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbows, revealing forearms inked with tiny symbols, lines and dots. A constellation she didn't yet understand. You never told me what these mean, she said. Reaching out slowly, fingertips hovering just over his skin. Kale looked at her hand, then met her gaze. They're from a language no one speaks anymore. Do they say something? They ask something. What? Kale's eyes darkened just slightly. What is love if it's only almost? Alara felt the air shift. The space between them tightened, turned electric. Her hand dropped to her lap. Her voice was barely audible. What does that mean? It means, he leaned forward just a little, that some people live their whole lives brushing up against what could have been, too scared to let it in. The silence between them was heavier than anything she'd ever known. She could feel her pulse and her fingertips. Gale's eyes flicked to her lips, just once brief, but unmistakably Liz's breath caught. She could kiss him. She wanted to. Every part of her body leaned toward him, but something inside pulled back. A quiet, old fear. So she whispered, not yet. Kale didn't move away. He didn't push. Instead, he reached up slowly and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers brushed her cheek, soft, warm, and the butterflies in her stomach took flight. I'm not going anywhere, he said gently. Take all the time you need. And in that moment, without a kiss, without a single promise made, she felt the next few days were a blur of almost reaching for his hand when they crossed the street, almost resting her head on his shoulder during the late-night movie, almost confessing how he made her feel like the whole world had been holding its breath until he walked into it. But Kale never pushed. He never asked for more than she offered, and that made her want to give him everything. One evening, they walked to the park, the quiet kind with old oak trees and a rusted swing set where no children played after dark. They sat on a bench beneath the biggest tree. Kale was holding something, a small, weathered notebook. This, he said, placing it in her lap, is the first thing I ever wrote that mattered. Alara opened the cover slowly. Inside were handwritten notes, sketches, scraps of poems and paragraphs. It wasn't polished. It was Raw, honest, vulnerable, she read the first page aloud, her voice soft. There's a space between loneliness and love, a narrow bridge made of looks that linger too long, and hands that almost touch. That's where I live now. That's where I... Wait. Her throat closed. She looked up at him. You wrote this before we met? Kale nodded. I don't believe in coincidence, he said quietly. Eller's eyes burned. Why me? She whispered. Kale looked at her like she was a secret he'd been keeping for years. Because, he said, when I wrote about the space between, I didn't know it could be filled until I saw you, standing in the rain, looking like someone who'd been waiting too. Alara felt tears rise. Not sad ones, not exactly, just full. He reached over, gently wiped one away with his thumb. Still, not asking for anything, he said softly. Just letting you see me. The following days were unusually quiet. Kale wasn't distant. Not exactly, but something in him had shifted, like a tide drawing back just before the wave returns. Alara felt it, not in the way he looked at her, which was still warm and full of quiet reverence, but in the pauses, in the silences that no longer felt soft, but heavy. One night, she found him on the bookstore steps again. Like the first time they met, he was staring up at the stars, his eyes unreadable. I don't want to guess anymore, she said, walking up to him. If there's something you're not telling me, I'd rather hear it than fill in the blanks with things I'll regret thinking. Kale stood slowly, hands in his pockets. There was a long silence. Then he said, I've been sick. Alara's heart stopped. Kale looked away. 2 years ago, I was diagnosed with a rare neurological condition. It's stable, for now manageable, but it was worse before I left my old life behind when I thought it was the end. But then it wasn't, and I didn't know what to do with that second chance. Alara's voice barely made it past her lips. So you ran. Nodded once. I stopped writing. I stopped answering calls. I erased almost everything until I saw you. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was fading anymore. Her eyes burned again, but this time it wasn't from fear. You think? This changes how I see you? He looked at her, and for the first time she saw fear in his eyes. I think, he said slowly, I didn't want you to see me as fragile or broken or as a countdown. She stepped closer. I see you as here, she whispered. Now that's all I've ever needed. Kale exhaled, a sound halfway between a sigh and a sob. She reached for his hand, and this time he didn't just hold. I've pulled her gently into his arms, resting his forehead against hers. The closeness was quite safe. She closed her eyes. Kale, she said softly, I don't care how much time we have. I only care that we don't waste any of it. The next time he came to her door, it was raining again, like the universe was writing its own poetry. She opened the door to find him standing there. Soap this. Time. No umbrella, no coat, just Kale, and a look in his eyes that said he'd made peace with the things he couldn't control. May I come in? He asked, voice barely audible over the rain. She stepped aside, and he walked in, trailing water. In silence, I wrote something, he said, pulling a folded paper from his pocket. Alara took it, unfolding it slowly. Her eyes moved over the words. Her hands began to shake. If I could live forever in a single moment, it would be the one before you kissed me, the breathless heartbeat, the silence between souls, the universe holding its breath, waiting for us to fall in. She looked up at him. He stepped closer, and this time there was no hesitation, no fear, no almost. Their lips met like a secret finally spoken aloud. Slow, deep, honest. It wasn't fireworks. It wasn't explosions. It was gravity, her hands in his hair, his thumb brushing the corner of her jaw, and the rain singing outside like it had waited just for this. The days after the kiss were quieter, not because the magic had faded, but because it had settled like embers, glowing steady and warm. They spent hours doing nothing, reading side by side, making pancakes at 2 a.m., Watching old black and white films with subtitles and no sound it wasn't about what they did. It was the way time slowed between them, the way she laughed more now, the way he watched her like she was a new chapter he hadn't written yet one night. He brought her a small envelope. Inside was a single key to the lake house, he said. I used to go there when I needed to disappear, but now I want to share it with you. Alara turned the key over in her hand. It feels like a beginning, she whispered. Kale smiled. It is. The sun was just setting when Alara turned the key in the lock. Lake House breathed a quiet welcome, wooden floors creaking softly beneath their feet. Walls whispering stories of summers long gone. Kale pulled open the windows, letting in a breeze that smelled like pine and rain-soaked earth. They wandered through the rooms, touching the faded wallpaper, running fingers over dust-covered shelves. This place, Kale said, voice low and sure, holds all the beginnings we couldn't have imagined. Alara smiled, her fingers intertwining with his. Then let's promise to fill it with our stories. He nodded, pulling her close until the world shrank to just the two of them. Their breaths mingled, he whispered. No more almost. She rested her forehead against his. Only us. Sunlight spilled across the floorboards, waking them gently. Alara's eyes fluttered open to find Kale tracing lazy circles on her bare arm. Morning, he murmured. Morning, she replied, voice thick with sleep. They lay there, tangled in sheets, listening to the soft symphony of birds and the distant lapping of the lake. When they finally rose, the kitchen filled with the smell of freshly brewed coffee and cinnamon. Kale flipped pancakes with a clumsy grace, laughter spilling freely. When one landed on the floor, Alara caught his hand, squeezing it softly, perfectly imperfect. He grinned, just like us. Alara's fingers trembled as she unfolded the brittle pages. Kale sat beside her, eyes dark and distant. Each letter was a fragment, memories stitched together with ink myras. Words spoke of love lost and dreams abandoned. Why didn't she stay? Alara asked softly. Kale swallowed hard. I don't know, but these letters, they are part of me I never understood until now. Alara leaned into him. Maybe it's time to write new letters, ones full of hope. He nodded, a tear slipping. Free the world tipped and spun. Kale's breath hitched, pain searing through his limbs. Alara caught him, arms steady and warm. Shy, I'm here, she whispered, voice a soothing balm. The rain tapped a rhythm against the window. A quiet lullaby. Hours passed like seconds. When dawn broke, Kale opened his eyes to find her watching over him. Love unwavering. The storm had passed, but the air still shimmered with electricity. Kale took Alara's hand. Dance with me? She laughed softly, nodding. They moved slowly, imperfect steps, hearts beating in unison. The fire crackled, casting shadows that danced with them. In that moment, nothing else existed but the warmth of their embrace. Wrapped in a blanket, they sat. Beneath the vast sky, stars glittered like distant promises. Gale pulled out his notebook, its pages filled with beginnings. This is our story, he said softly. Alara smiled. Heartful, they wrote by starlight, each word a testament to love, to hope, to forever. The lake was calm, mirroring the soft hues of dawn. Alara and Kale sat side by side on the porch, wrapped in a single blanket, fingers entwined. Neither spoke. Words felt too loud for this moment. Instead, they let the silence speak. A gentle breeze carried the scent of pine and fresh dew. Kale finally broke the quiet, voice low and steady. Whatever happens next, I'm grateful for this, for us. Alara turned to him, eyes shining. Me too. You've made me believe in second chances. He brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. And I promise, no matter the days we have left, I'll make everyone count. She smiled. Heartful, they watched as the sun peaked over the horizon, painting the world gold. Months later, the lake house was alive, filled with laughter, whispered dreams, and new memories. Gale was stronger. Lara was braver. Together, They had found a love that wasn't perfect, but it was real one. Evening, under a sky dusted with stars, Kale pulled Alara close. Will you stay with me? He whispered. Forever. She replied without hesitation. Their lips met, slow and tender, a promise written in the language of hearts, and as the world held its breath around them, the echoes of their love stretched out, infinite, timeless.